Imagine walking through a city gate and being hit by the smell of animal dung, roasting meat, and unwashed bodies all at the same time. The narrow streets are so packed with people that you can barely move. Merchants are screaming prices at you in 3 different languages. Roman soldiers are shoving through the crowd with their hands on their swords. And somewhere in the distance, you can hear the bleating of thousands upon thousands of lambs waiting to be slaughtered. This is Jerusalem, not the quiet, sacred place you might picture in your mind, not the golden, glowing city from the paintings. This was a loud, chaotic, politically explosive place. And during Passover week, it became one of the most dangerous cities in the entire Roman Empire. The week that Jesus of Nazareth was arrested, tried, and executed was not a normal week. But it also wasn't a quiet one. To understand what actually happened and why it happened the way it did, you need to understand what Jerusalem looked like, smelled like, and felt like during those 7 days. Because the city itself explains almost everything. So let's go back, about 2,000 years, and let's walk through a single day in the life of this city during the most famous week in human history. First, you need to understand the size of what we're talking about. Jerusalem in the year 30 AD was not a big city. Depending on which historian you trust, the permanent population was somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 people. Think of a small college town. That's Jerusalem on a regular day. But Passover changed everything. Every Jewish male who lived within a reasonable distance was expected to make the pilgrimage to Jerusalem for the feast. And reasonable distance was generous. Jews came from Galilee in the north, from the Judean countryside, from the coast, from across the Jordan River. Some traveled from as far away as Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, even Rome itself. The Jewish historian Josephus, who lived just a few decades after Jesus, claimed that during one Passover, the priests counted over 250,000 lambs sacrificed at the temple. If each lamb served a group of 10 to 20 people, you're looking at somewhere between 2.5 million and 5 million visitors pouring into this tiny city. Now, those numbers are almost certainly exaggerated. Josephus had a habit of inflating things to impress his Roman readers. But even conservative modern estimates put the Passover crowd at around 300,000 to 400,000 people. That means Jerusalem's population swelled by 10 times its normal size, maybe more. Think about what that does to a city with no modern infrastructure, no plumbing in most homes, no public transportation, streets barely wide enough for 2 donkeys to pass each other, and a Roman military garrison that was already nervous about crowd control. This is the backdrop. This is the world that Jesus walked into. Your day in Jerusalem during Passover week would have started before the sun came up. And I mean well before. Around 4 or 4:30 in the morning, the city was already stirring. Not because people were early risers by choice, but because there was simply too much to do, and not enough hours of daylight to do it in. If you were a pilgrim, you were probably sleeping outside the city walls. There were no hotels. A few wealthier visitors might have arranged to stay with relatives or rented a room in someone's house, which is exactly what Jesus and his disciples did for the Last Supper. But the vast majority of pilgrims set up camp on the hillsides surrounding the city, especially the Mount of Olives to the east and the slopes leading down toward Bethany. Imagine thousands of small cooking fires dotting the hills in the pre-dawn darkness. Families huddled under goatskin tents or open-air shelters made from branches and cloth. Children sleeping on the ground beside their parents. The first sound you would have heard was the trumpet blast from the temple. The priests blew a series of trumpet calls at the first sign of dawn, signaling that the morning sacrifice was about to begin. This was a daily ritual, not just for Passover. Every single morning, a lamb was sacrificed on the great altar in the temple courtyard as an offering to God. But during Passover week, that morning blast carried extra weight. It meant the day had begun, and everyone needed to move. If you were camped on the Mount of Olives, you would have rolled up your sleeping mat, splashed some water on your face from one of the stone cisterns scattered around the hillside, and started walking toward the city gates. The Kidron Valley sat between you and the city walls. It was steep, narrow, and during Passover, It was basically a river of people, all heading in the same direction. You would have entered through one of the eastern gates, and the moment you stepped inside the walls, the noise would have hit you. Jerusalem's streets were not the wide, open boulevards you might imagine. The main roads were maybe 10 to 15 feet wide in the best sections, and the side streets and alleys could be as narrow as 4 or 5 feet. During Passover, every inch of available space was taken. Vendors set up shop wherever they could, spreading their goods on blankets on the ground or hanging them from ropes stretched between buildings. You could buy dried fish from the Sea of Galilee, figs from Jericho, dates from the Jordan Valley, olive oil, wine, bread, sandals, clay pots, wool cloaks, and just about anything else you might need for the week. The smell was something you would never forget. Raw sewage ran in open channels down the center of some streets. Animal waste from the donkeys and pack animals was everywhere. Butchers worked in open-air stalls, hanging fresh meat where flies covered it within seconds. Tanneries on the southern slope reeked of urine, which was used to soften leather. And mixed in with all of that was the heavy, sweet smell of incense drifting down from the temple and the constant smoke from cooking fires. It wasn't pleasant by modern standards, but to a first-century person, this was just what a city smelled like. But the biggest business during Passover was animals. If you were observing the feast properly, you needed a lamb, a perfect, unblemished, year-old male lamb. And if you hadn't brought one from home, or if yours had gotten injured on the journey, you had to buy one in Jerusalem. The animal merchants knew this. They set up massive livestock markets just outside the temple area and along the southern wall of the city. The noise from these markets was unbelievable. Thousands of sheep, goats, and cattle packed into pens, bleating and lowing, merchants arguing with buyers, inspectors checking animals for defects, deals being negotiated in Aramaic, Greek, and Hebrew all at once. And here's the thing that made it even more complicated. You couldn't just pay for your lamb with any currency. The temple had its own monetary system. Roman coins, which were the standard currency everywhere else, had images of the emperor on them, Caesar's face, sometimes even inscriptions calling him a god. This made Roman coins ritually unclean in the eyes of the temple authorities. So, before you could buy your sacrificial lamb, you had to exchange your money. The money changers sat in the outer courts of the temple at long tables piled with coins. They exchanged Roman denarii and Greek drachmas for Tyrian shekels, which were the only currency accepted for temple transactions, and they charged a fee for every exchange. If the Gospels are accurate, these money changers had turned the court of the Gentiles into something that looked a lot more like a marketplace than a place of worship, which is exactly why Jesus flipped their tables. That incident, by the way, probably happened on either Sunday or Monday of Passover week. And it didn't just upset a few merchants. It was a direct challenge to the economic system that kept the temple running. The high priest and his family controlled the animal trade and the money exchange. They got a cut of every transaction. When Jesus overturned those tables and drove out the merchants, he wasn't making a symbolic gesture. He was attacking the income stream of the most powerful family in Jerusalem. That's why the chief priests started looking for a way to kill him almost immediately. But let's keep walking through the day. By mid-morning, the temple itself was the center of everything. And when I say the temple, I need you to forget whatever small building you might be picturing. The temple complex in Jerusalem was one of the largest religious structures in the ancient world. Herod the Great had spent decades expanding and renovating it. The entire platform was roughly 35 acres. That's about the size of 26 football fields. The outer walls rose up to 150 feet above the street below. The stones used in construction weighed anywhere from 2 to over 500 tons each. When Jesus' disciples pointed at the temple and marveled at its beauty, they weren't exaggerating. Even Roman writers, who had seen the Colosseum and the great temples of Greece, admitted that the Jerusalem temple was breathtaking. The outer courtyard, the court of the Gentiles, was the part that anyone could enter. Jews, non-Jews, tourists, merchants, beggars, everyone. This was the area that had essentially become a bazaar during Passover. Beyond that was the court of women, which was as far as Jewish women could go, then the court of Israel, where Jewish men could stand, and then the court of the priests, where only the priestly class could enter. At the very center stood the sanctuary building itself, and within it, the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest could go, and even he only once a year on the Day of Atonement. During Passover week, the entire temple complex was bursting with people. Pilgrims came to pray, to make offerings, to have their lambs inspected by the priests, and to fulfill various purity rituals. If you had become ritually impure during your journey, which was almost inevitable if you had touched a dead animal, walked through a cemetery, or come into contact with a non-Jew, you needed to go through a purification process. This usually involved immersing yourself in a mikveh, which was a ritual bath. Archaeologists have found dozens of mikvehs carved into the rock near the southern entrance to the temple. During Passover, the lines for these baths must have been enormous. And all of this was happening under the watchful eye of Rome. The Antonia fortress sat at the northwest corner of the temple platform. It was a massive military installation connected directly to the temple courts by a series of stairs and passageways. The Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, normally lived in Caesarea on the coast. But during Passover, he came to Jerusalem with extra troops specifically because the feast was a known flashpoint for civil unrest. Think about it from Rome's perspective. You've got 1 million+ religious pilgrims flooding into a city that you control through military force. These pilgrims are celebrating a holiday that specifically commemorates the time their God freed them from foreign oppression. The entire story of Passover is about liberation from an empire. And here they are, still living under an empire. The parallels were not lost on anyone. Roman soldiers patrolled the temple courts and lined the rooftops of the surrounding colonnades. They watched the crowds for any sign of trouble. If a preacher started gathering too large of a following, if someone started talking about a coming king who would overthrow the Romans, if there was any hint of organized resistance, the soldiers were under orders to shut it down immediately. This had happened before. Josephus records multiple incidents during Passover where Roman soldiers killed Jewish pilgrims. In one case, a soldier made an obscene gesture toward the crowd from the rooftop of the colonnade, and the resulting riot led to a stampede that killed thousands. In another, a Roman soldier burned a Torah scroll, and the outrage nearly turned into a full-scale revolt. So when Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey and crowds started waving palm branches and shouting about the coming kingdom, every Roman soldier in the city would have been on high alert. And every Jewish authority who was responsible for keeping the peace, which was part of their deal with Rome, would have been panicking. The donkey itself was a political statement, by the way. The prophet Zechariah had written that Israel's future king would come riding on a donkey. Everyone in the crowd would have recognized the reference. This wasn't a humble man choosing modest transportation. This was a deliberate prophetic claim. And the palm branches weren't just festive decorations. Palms were a symbol of Jewish nationalism. They appeared on the coins minted during the Maccabean revolt, the last time the Jews had successfully thrown off a foreign occupier. Waving palm branches was the first-century equivalent of waving a revolutionary flag. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Pontius Pilate was making his own entrance. Historical records suggest that the Roman governor typically arrived in Jerusalem from the west, entering through the Jaffa Gate with a full military procession. War horses, armored cavalry, foot soldiers in formation, standards bearing the image of Caesar. It was a deliberate show of force timed to coincide with the arrival of the Passover crowds. Rome's message was clear. We know what you're celebrating, and we want you to see exactly who is in charge. So you had 2 processions entering Jerusalem from opposite sides of the city on the same day. One from the east on a donkey, one from the west on a war horse, one representing the kingdom of God, the other representing the kingdom of Caesar. The clash between these 2 kingdoms would define the rest of the week. By the afternoon, the heat would have been significant. Jerusalem sits at about 2,500 feet above sea level, so it's not as brutally hot as somewhere like Jericho down in the valley. But in the spring, temperatures could easily reach the upper 80s or low 90s, and with hundreds of thousands of people crammed into a city with almost no shade outside of the temple colonnades, the heat was oppressive. The social dynamics were just as intense as the weather. Jerusalem during Passover was a melting pot of tensions that went far beyond the obvious Roman occupation. You had Pharisees who were focused on strict personal observance of the law. They believed that if every Jew kept the commandments perfectly, God would intervene and restore Israel. Then you had the Sadducees, the wealthy priestly aristocracy who controlled the temple. They collaborated openly with Rome because that collaboration kept them in power. They didn't believe in resurrection or angels, and they looked down on the Pharisees as religious extremists. Then there were the Zealots, who believed the only answer to Roman occupation was armed resistance. They carried hidden daggers under their cloaks and assassinated Roman sympathizers in broad daylight, melting back into the crowd before anyone could identify them. The Romans called them sicari, dagger men. During Passover, with the streets so packed and chaotic, the sicari were at their most dangerous. And then there were the common people: farmers, fishermen, shepherds, carpenters, tanners, weavers. The vast majority of Passover pilgrims were ordinary working people who had scraped together enough money and time off to make the journey. They weren't political revolutionaries or religious scholars. They were families who came to worship, to fulfill their religious obligations, and to experience the one week of the year when they felt connected to something bigger than their daily grind. This is the audience that listened to Jesus teach in the temple courts earlier in the week, and this is why the authorities couldn't arrest him in public. He was popular with exactly the kind of people who had nothing to lose and everything to be angry about. Water was a constant concern. Jerusalem had no river running through it. The city's water came from cisterns, underground channels, and a few natural springs, the most important being the Gihon Spring on the eastern slope. Hezekiah's tunnel, built centuries earlier, channeled water from the Gihon Spring into the pool of Siloam inside the city walls. During Passover, this pool would have been mobbed with people filling water jars, washing, and performing ritual purifications. The Pool of Bethesda, near the Sheep Gate in the northern part of the city, was another major water source. The Gospel of John describes Jesus healing a man there who had been waiting by the pool for 38 years. Whether you take that story literally or not, the pool was real. Archaeologists discovered it in the 19th century, exactly where John said it was. 2 large basins surrounded by 5 covered porticos, fed by an intermittent spring that would cause the water to bubble and stir. Food during Passover followed strict rules. On the 14th of Nisan, the day the lambs were slaughtered, every household had to remove all leaven from their home. No yeast bread, no fermented dough, nothing with leaven of any kind. This was a commemoration of the original exodus from Egypt, when the Israelites left so quickly that their bread didn't have time to rise. For the rest of the week, you ate unleavened bread, matzah, along with bitter herbs, lamb, and other prescribed foods. But getting to that Passover meal required a process that modern sensibilities might find difficult to stomach. On the afternoon of the 14th of Nisan, the lambs were slaughtered at the temple. This was not a quiet, private affair. The pilgrims were divided into 3 groups because the temple courtyard simply could not hold everyone at once. The first group entered, the gates were closed behind them, and the slaughter began. Each family or group brought their lamb to the priests. The lamb's throat was cut, and the blood was caught in gold and silver basins. These basins were passed from priest to priest in a chain until they reached the altar, where the blood was thrown against the base. While this was happening, the Levites sang the Hallel Psalms, Psalms 113 through 118. If the Hallel was finished before the slaughter was complete, they sang it again, and if necessary, a 3rd time. The sound of thousands of lambs being killed, combined with the chanting of the Levites and the prayers of the worshippers, must have been overwhelming. After the blood ritual, the lamb was taken to a designated area, hung on hooks or wooden frames, skinned, and the fat portions were removed and burned on the altar as an offering. The rest of the animal was taken by the family, carried through the streets to wherever they were staying, and roasted whole over an open fire. No bones could be broken. By evening, the entire city would have been filled with the smell of roasting lamb. Thousands of cooking fires on the hillsides and in every courtyard and rooftop in the city. Families gathered around the meal, reclining on cushions or mats in the custom of the time. The father or head of the household led the Seder, telling the story of the Exodus, dipping bitter herbs in salt water to remember the tears of slavery, eating the unleavened bread and the roasted lamb. This is the meal that Jesus shared with his disciples on what Christians call Maundy Thursday, the Last Supper. When Jesus took the bread and said, "This is my body," and took the cup of wine and said, "This is my blood," he was doing it within the framework of a Passover Seder that every person at that table had celebrated their entire lives. The significance was not lost on them. He was reinterpreting the entire Passover narrative. Instead of the lamb whose blood saved the Israelites from death in Egypt, he was pointing to himself. But let's step back from the religious significance for a moment and just look at the practical reality of that evening. Jerusalem after dark during Passover was not a safe place. The city had no street lighting, no police force. The narrow alleys were pitch black once the sun went down. The only light came from the cooking fires and oil lamps in people's homes and campsites. Petty crime was common. Pilgrims carrying money and valuables were obvious targets. Roman patrols continued through the night, but they couldn't be everywhere. The Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus went to pray after the Last Supper and where he was eventually arrested, was located on the western slope of the Mount of Olives, just across the Kidron Valley from the city. It was an olive grove, probably privately owned, where Jesus and his group had apparently been staying during their time in Jerusalem. The name Gethsemane comes from the Aramaic word for oil press. It was a working agricultural site, not a manicured garden. Ancient olive trees, stone walls, maybe a wooden press structure. In the darkness, with only the stars and the distant glow of the city's fires for light, it would have been almost impossible to see more than a few feet in front of you. The Gospels say that Jesus told his disciples he was deeply troubled. Luke describes him sweating drops of blood, which sounds like a literary exaggeration, but is actually a documented medical condition called hematidrosis, triggered by extreme psychological stress. Whether or not that detail is literal, the writers wanted you to understand that this was not a man calmly accepting his fate. He was terrified. And then the torches appeared. When Judas arrived with the armed group sent by the chief priests, it was probably well after midnight. The torches they carried would have been visible from a long distance in the darkness of the Kidron Valley, flickering as the group descended the slope toward the olive grove. According to John's Gospel, the group included not just temple guards, but a detachment of Roman soldiers. If that's accurate, it means Pilate had already been consulted. The Roman governor knew about the arrest before it happened. This wasn't a rogue action by the Jewish authorities. It was coordinated. The arrest itself was deliberately done at night to avoid the crowds. The Jewish authorities knew that Jesus was popular with the Passover pilgrims. Arresting him in broad daylight at the temple could have started a riot. And a riot during Passover was exactly what both the chief priests and the Romans were trying to avoid. The timing was surgical. Grab him when his supporters are asleep, get a conviction before sunrise, hand him to Rome for execution before anyone can organize a response. The trial that followed happened in the hours before dawn. This was unusual and, according to later Jewish legal traditions, technically illegal. The Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council, was not supposed to meet at night or hold capital trials during festival periods, but the urgency of the situation overrode protocol. The chief priests needed a conviction before the city woke up and the crowds found out what was happening. By dawn on Friday, the 15th of Nisan, Jesus had already been transferred to Pontius Pilate at the governor's residence. The praetorium, where Pilate held court, was likely either the old palace of Herod on the western hill or the Antonia fortress next to the temple. Either way, the trial before Pilate happened in the early morning hours, while the city was still getting started for the day. Now, Pilate gets a complicated reputation in the Gospels. The writers portray him as reluctant, almost sympathetic, a man who couldn't find any guilt in Jesus, but was pressured by the crowd. But everything we know about Pilate from other sources paints a very different picture. Josephus and the philosopher Philo both describe him as cruel, inflexible, and prone to executing people without trial. He had already caused multiple incidents in Jerusalem by bringing Roman standards bearing Caesar's image into the city and by raiding the temple treasury to fund an aqueduct. Both times, Jewish protesters ended up dead. So when the chief priests brought Jesus to Pilate and told him this man claims to be a king, Pilate understood exactly what was happening. He didn't need convincing. A man claiming to be king of the Jews was, by definition, a rival to Caesar. That was treason, and the penalty for treason in every corner of the Roman Empire was the same: crucifixion. The conversation between Pilate and the Jewish leaders was a political dance, not a search for justice. Pilate needed the Jewish authorities to maintain order among the population. The Jewish authorities needed Pilate's military power to protect their position. Neither side actually cared about whether Jesus was guilty of anything. They cared about keeping the system running smoothly. And Jesus, by disrupting that system, had made himself a problem that both sides wanted eliminated. The Barabbas episode, where Pilate offers to release either Jesus or a convicted rebel and the crowd chooses Barabbas, drives this home. Barabbas was likely a zealot, someone involved in actual armed resistance against Rome. The crowd chose the violent revolutionary over the peaceful preacher. That tells you where the energy in Jerusalem was during Passover. The people wanted someone who would fight, and here's a detail that often gets overlooked. The Jewish leaders who brought Jesus to Pilate refused to enter the Praetorium because it was a Gentile building, and entering it would have made them ritually impure, which would have prevented them from eating the Passover meal. Think about that for a second. They were orchestrating the execution of a man, but they were worried about stepping inside the wrong building because it might interfere with their dinner plans. The Gospel of John specifically mentions this detail, and whether you read it as irony or hypocrisy or both, it tells you something about the strange collision of religion and politics that defined that week. By mid-morning on Friday, Jesus was carrying his cross through the streets toward the execution site. The route, which later tradition would call the Via Dolorosa, wound through the narrow streets of the upper city and out through one of the gates in the northern wall to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. The streets would have been full of people, Passover pilgrims going about their business, merchants selling food and goods, Roman soldiers everywhere. The crucifixion procession was not an unusual sight. Rome crucified people regularly, especially during festivals when they wanted to send a message. The condemned carried the horizontal beam of the cross, the patibulum, through the streets to the execution site, where a vertical post was already planted in the ground. Crucifixion was designed to be public. That was the whole point. It was Rome's way of saying, "This is what happens if you challenge us." The crosses were placed along major roads and near city gates, where the maximum number of people would see them. Golgotha was likely just outside the city walls, possibly near a major road, exactly where you would want an execution to be visible. And the process itself was engineered to maximize suffering. The condemned was typically stripped naked, which in Jewish culture was an extreme humiliation. The wrists were nailed to the horizontal beam, the patibulum, which was then lifted and attached to the vertical post. The feet were nailed to the upright, sometimes with a single nail through both ankles. There was no comfortable position. To breathe, the victim had to push up on the nails through their feet, which caused searing pain, take a breath, and then sag back down. This cycle repeated for hours, sometimes days. The cause of death was usually a combination of shock, dehydration, blood loss, and eventually asphyxiation, when the victim no longer had the strength to push up and breathe. It was, by any measure, one of the cruelest execution methods ever invented, and Rome used it deliberately against political prisoners and rebels to send a message to anyone who might be thinking about resistance. The sign Pilate placed above the cross read, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews," written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek, so that every person in Jerusalem could read it regardless of what language they spoke. The chief priests objected to the wording. They wanted it changed to, "He claimed to be King of the Jews." Pilate refused. "What I have written, I have written." It was a final political jab, not at Jesus, but at the Jewish leaders. This is what happens to Jewish kings under Roman rule. While Jesus was dying on the cross, which according to the Gospels took about 6 hours from roughly 9 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon, the rest of Jerusalem was going about its Passover business. People were at the temple making offerings, families were preparing for the evening meal, merchants were selling their goods. Life in the city did not stop because of one crucifixion. This is maybe the strangest thing to wrap your head around. For the hundreds of thousands of people in Jerusalem that week, the execution of Jesus of Nazareth was a footnote. He was one of probably 3 men crucified that day. The Gospels mention 2 others. Crucifixions were common enough that people walked past them without stopping. The average pilgrim who came to Jerusalem for Passover in the year 30 AD went home that week, having no idea that anything historically significant had happened. No Roman record from that week even mentions it. No Jewish document from the period notes it as remarkable. It was a local execution of a Galilean preacher who had caused some trouble at the temple and gotten on the wrong side of the authorities. That's it. And yet, the afternoon Jesus died, according to all 4 Gospels, something unusual happened. The sky grew dark. Whether this was a natural phenomenon, a dust storm, an eclipse, or something else entirely depends on who you ask. The Gospels also report that the massive curtain in the temple, the one that separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the sanctuary, tore in 2 from top to bottom. And there was an earthquake. Whether you believe these events happened literally or see them as theological symbolism, the writers were making a point. Something had shifted. The normal rhythms of life in Jerusalem, the daily sacrifices, the Passover rituals, the entire system that revolved around the temple, all of it was being reframed. Because of the approaching Sabbath and the ongoing Passover festival, the bodies needed to come down from the crosses before sundown on Friday. Jewish law prohibited leaving a body hanging overnight, and the Sabbath rest began at sunset. This is why the Gospel of John mentions that soldiers broke the legs of the 2 men crucified alongside Jesus to speed up their deaths, but found that Jesus was already dead. Joseph of Arimathea, described as a wealthy member of the Sanhedrin, requested the body from Pilate and placed it in a newly cut tomb nearby. The burial was rushed. There was no time for the full burial customs, which involved washing the body, anointing it with spices, and wrapping it in linen strips. That would have to wait until after the Sabbath. The women who had followed Jesus from Galilee noted where the tomb was, planning to return on Sunday morning to finish the job properly. And then the Sabbath fell. From Friday at sunset until Saturday at sunset, Jerusalem went quiet. The Sabbath during Passover was considered an especially holy day. No work was permitted, no buying or selling, no traveling beyond a short distance. The streets, which had been packed with hundreds of thousands of people for the past several days, emptied. Families stayed in their camps or borrowed rooms, eating the leftover Passover food, reading scripture, resting. The Roman soldiers remained at their posts. The temple guards continued their patrols, but the frantic energy of the week paused for 24 hours. For the followers of Jesus, those 24 hours must have been agonizing. Their teacher was dead. Their movement, which had attracted thousands of followers across Galilee and Judea, appeared to be over. Everything they had left behind, their fishing nets, their tax booths, their families, their livelihoods, they had left it all to follow a man who said the kingdom of God was at hand. And now, he was buried in a borrowed tomb. It's worth pausing here to consider what Messiah meant to a first-century Jew, because it's not what it means in a modern church. The expected Messiah was a political and military leader, a king in the line of David who would rally the Jewish people, defeat the occupying empire, and restore Israel to its former glory. Think less gentle shepherd and more warrior king. The fact that some of Jesus' own disciples had been arguing about who would sit at his right hand in the coming kingdom tells you what they were expecting. They thought they were joining a revolution that would end in victory. Instead, it ended on a Roman cross, which for a first-century Jewish audience was not just a defeat, it was a curse. The book of Deuteronomy says that anyone who hangs on a tree is cursed by God. A crucified Messiah was a contradiction in terms. It was like saying the king who lost every battle. The concept simply did not compute. They had seen Rome's answer to messianic claims before. Crucifixion was the standard punishment, and dead messiahs, by definition, were failed messiahs. In the context of first-century Jewish expectation, a messiah who got killed by the Romans was not the messiah. He was just another tragic figure in a long line of them. Peter and the other disciples were in hiding, according to the Gospels. They were afraid that the same authorities who had arrested Jesus would come for them next, and that fear was reasonable. The Romans and the temple authorities had every incentive to round up the inner circle and eliminate the movement entirely. Then came Sunday morning. The women went to the tomb before dawn, carrying the spices they had prepared to anoint the body. What they found, or rather what they didn't find, would change the trajectory of human history in ways that no one in Jerusalem that week could have predicted. But that's the thing about this particular week. Nobody in Jerusalem understood what was happening while it was happening. The Roman governor processed it as a routine execution. The high priest processed it as eliminating a political threat. The disciples processed it as the end of everything they had hoped for. And the hundreds of thousands of Passover pilgrims processed it as background noise. The city that week was doing what cities do. It was feeding people, moving goods, processing money, managing crowds, maintaining order, performing rituals, and getting through the days. A day in Jerusalem during Passover week was exhausting, overwhelming, smelly, loud, dangerous, and sacred, all at the same time. It was a place where you could worship God in the morning, get cheated by a money changer before lunch, watch a man die on a cross in the afternoon, and sit down with your family for the most meaningful meal of the year that same evening. The week Jesus was crucified was not a week when the world stopped. It was a week when the world kept going, and something happened in the middle of it that the world is still trying to make sense of 2,000 years later. If this video put you in the streets of first-century Jerusalem in a way that felt real, you need to see the one that's on screen right now. It goes just as deep into a story you think you know but don't. Click it now, and subscribe if you want more history that actually puts you in the room where it happened.